Hey, Landon Trop again with Unraveling Flexbox, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make the playback controls for a video player. So the cool thing about this layout is that it uses all of the techniques you've learned so far with Flexbox. So if you look closely at this layout, you'll notice that it can be divided into a few distinct sections. So for the top controls, we have the volume controls, the playback controls, and the size controls. And for the bottom, we have the progress controls. So let's go ahead and represent this with HTML. To save a little time here, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. So you'll notice that there's nothing crazy here. We have a container for the video player, along with an image to represent the video. So inside the video player container is a div with a class of controls container. And this will be used for containing the controls. So the top row of the controls is represented by this div, and it's split into three sections: the volume controls, the playback controls, and the size controls. The bottom row is devoted entirely to the progress controls. So the first thing you need to do is center the video player controls in the container. You can do this by absolutely positioning the controls container over the top of the video player. This allows the video player div to be determined by the size of the image inside of it. While we're at it, we'll add some CSS to size the controls container so you can see it. So that black bar in the top left corner of the controls container is our controls div. But what we want is for it to be positioned in the bottom center. So we can accomplish this by setting the controls container's display to flex and using align items in justify content. The next step is to build the progress controls. The HTML for these is pretty straightforward. So what we're looking for here is to place the time elapsed and time remaining spans on the left and right side of the container, and for that range input to fill up the remaining space between them. So what's that auto value in the time elapsed and time remaining styles? Well, setting the flex basis to auto tells Flexbox to resize the container based on the size of the content. So in this case, the time elapsed and time remaining spans take up as much room as they need, and then the progress control slider stretches to fill up the remaining space. The top controls are a little bit trickier than the bottom controls. Let's start with the markup. So the first section we'll build is the volume controls, and there's nothing too fancy here. We'll use a couple buttons containing images for the low volume and high volume icons, and we'll use a range input for the slider. Next, we'll do the playback controls. These are pretty much the same thing as the volume controls, except for we won't be using a slider. Finally, we'll add the size controls. And once again, it's just a button with an image in it. So the markup doesn't look very nice yet, but it'll do the job. So our first step is to style the top controls to display them side by side. In order to do that, we'll need to set the top container's display to flex. Remember, the default value for flex direction is row, so the container's contents will be displayed horizontally. While we're at it, we'll also add a little margin to the bottom of the top controls. To make the volume controls, playback controls, and size controls display horizontally, we'll also need to make each one of those a flex container. We'll also use the Align Items property to vertically center their content. Next, we need to add some space between them. So you might be thinking that you could make the volume control and size control containers size to their content and have the playback controls stretch to fit the remaining space using flex grow and flex shrink. Let's go ahead and try that. The problem with this approach is that the volume controls are a different size than the size controls. So if we tell the playback controls to fill up the remaining space, then they can't center in the container. The solution is to make the playback controls size to their content and let the volume and size controls expand instead. Next, we need to move the full button to the right side of the screen. The very last step is to add a small margin around the buttons and time spans. And that's it. For an extra challenge, try replacing the image with an actual video element and making the player work. Then you can kick back and watch your favorite movie on a player that you built yourself.